Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. It was the worst day of her life. Standing at the edge of the grave, her legs trembling, her heart shattered into pieces, she couldn't understand how this was happening. The love of her life, the man she had shared everything with, was walking away from her, at their son's funeral. Her eyes locked on him as he turned his back, his face cold, his steps heavy. It felt like time slowed down, the ground beneath her feet unsteady. But in that moment, her mind wasn't focused on the raw ache in her chest or the tears threatening to spill over. No, it was something much darker, a memory that had been buried deep, something he didn't know about. What had she done? She couldn't even comprehend it herself. As her husband disappeared into the crowd, she stood frozen. The whispers around her became muffled, the world narrowing into a tunnel. No one knew the truth. No one knew what she had done in those days leading up to this, before everything changed. And as he walked away, the realization hit her hard. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something far more twisted than anyone could ever imagine. The world around her felt unreal. It was as if she was floating above it all. The flowers, the mourners, the priest's voice speaking words of comfort, everything was distant, unimportant. Her world had stopped. She didn't even hear the comforting words from her closest friends or the faint sobs of other mothers who had lost their children. No, the only thing that mattered now was that man, the man she had loved for years, was walking away from her. The wind picked up, blowing her hair into her face, but she didn't move. She was rooted to the spot. How had they gotten here? How had this beautiful day, this tragic yet necessary goodbye to their son, turned into a nightmare? A few months ago, everything had been perfect. The family was whole. They were happy. Sure, there were disagreements, there were issues like any couple has, but their love, their bond, had always been unshakable. Or so she thought. What went wrong? The thought kept repeating in her mind. But it wasn't a simple question. It was a question loaded with too many answers, all of them tangled in emotions, in guilt, in secrets that should have never been kept. As the wind whipped around her, she saw the shape of her husband disappear through the cemetery gates. His shoulders hunched, his head lowered, as if burdened by a weight only he could feel. He didn't look back, not even once. The woman he had once called his partner, the mother of his child, was still standing at the edge of their son's grave, her heart broken into 1,000 pieces, but it didn't matter to him anymore. He had made his decision. She felt her legs give out, but she caught herself just in time, gripping the gravestone for support. Her breaths were shallow, rapid. Like she was trying to run but her legs wouldn't carry her. The suffocating feeling, the overwhelming realization, threatened to drown her. She had no one left. No one. It had been hours since the funeral began, but in her mind, it felt like time was frozen. She could barely remember the service. The kind words, the looks of pity, the subtle glances of people who knew her too well, and the ones who didn't, none of it mattered now. All that mattered was that in this moment, when she had needed him the most, her husband had walked away. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, her knees weak. As the final words of the priest echoed in the distance, she closed her eyes. For a fleeting moment, the world blurred. In that moment, everything that had happened in the past few days came crashing down on her all at once. The secret she had buried so deep, the lies, the actions, things she couldn't even begin to understand anymore, flooded her mind. They had led her to this moment, this impossible moment, and there was no going back. What had she done? She could still remember the day everything changed. It hadn't been a grand event, no shocking revelation, no dramatic confrontation. It had been much quieter than that, more insidious, creeping into her life like a shadow until it consumed everything. It had started innocently enough, her desire to fix things, to make them right. She had been desperate. After everything they had been through, she couldn't let go. She couldn't lose him, especially not now, not after everything that had happened with their son. But her desperation had blinded her to the truth. The truth about what was happening to her, to them, to their marriage. She had acted on impulse, on fear, and it had cost her everything. Her heart sank as the memory of the decision she had made surfaced in her mind. She had thought she was protecting him. She had believed, with every fiber of her being, that what she did was necessary. But now? Now she could only see the wreckage it had caused. Her hands trembled as she wiped away the tears that had been falling since the moment he had walked away. What would he say if he knew? What would he do if he knew the truth? The secret was still locked in her mind, but its weight felt unbearable now, heavier than the grief of losing their son. It was like a poison spreading through her veins, clouding her judgment, clouding her heart. She was too far gone. As she looked toward the cemetery gates, where her husband had disappeared into the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all just the beginning. There was more to this story, much more. The truth would eventually come out, she just hoped that when it did, it wouldn't destroy them both. But in that moment, standing alone at the grave of her son, with her heart shattered and her marriage broken beyond repair, she couldn't help but wonder if she had already lost everything that truly mattered. The world around her continued to move, but she remained still. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned around, expecting to see one of the mourners, someone who might offer comfort. Instead, she saw a woman. A woman she didn't recognize, but whose face seemed oddly familiar. The woman's eyes were locked onto hers, and the look in them was almost knowing. The woman took a step forward, then stopped. There was an air of tension between them, a quiet understanding that neither of them could articulate. The woman didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all, she knew something. Something important. Something that would change everything. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, the woman turned and walked away, leaving nothing but a trail of unanswered questions behind her. Who was she? What did she know? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, as the first part of this twisted, inexplicable journey came to a close. But one thing was certain, the truth was coming. And it was going to shake everything to its core. The day passed in a blur, the world spinning around her while she stood motionless. The funeral had ended. The mourners had left, the soft hum of their conversations lingering in the air, fading away as each car disappeared down the winding road. The sky above had been a pale gray, but now the first stars of evening began to peek out, scattered like broken diamonds across a black velvet sky. Her hands, still trembling, gripped the edge of the gravestone as she fought to regain control of her breath. The air was thick, suffocating, and it felt like every breath she took was her last. The wind had picked up again, whipping through the cemetery with a chill that went straight to her bones, but it couldn't cool the heat rising from within her chest. That burning, gnawing feeling that had lodged there for days, for weeks, for months, was now an inferno. She closed her eyes and let the memories rush in. The night everything changed wasn't a night of drama, wasn't the type of night she could look back on with regret and guilt. It was just an ordinary evening, one where life had been, for a moment, simple. Her son had been at his friend's house, playing in the backyard while she and her husband, Paul, had settled in for what should have been a quiet evening. The house was empty, the smell of dinner still lingering in the air as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. It was one of those rare moments of calm after months of tension. After the arguments. After the resentment. But it wasn't enough. Paul had looked at her that night, his face unreadable. She had been too focused on the endless list of things she could no longer ignore, the repairs that were needed around the house, the mortgage payments, the new job offer that he hadn't spoken about. There had been too many things left unsaid between them. But, still, they tried to fill the silence. They had laughed together. He had held her hand across the table, as though everything would be okay. The evening seemed to drift on without incident until her son had come running through the door, his face flushed, breathless. His friend had forgotten his backpack, and her son had volunteered to take it back. As he'd rushed out of the house, his small body disappearing into the night, the door had slammed shut behind him. In the few seconds of silence that followed, everything had shifted. That was when she'd noticed the envelope on the counter. It was a simple, plain envelope, the kind you might use to mail a letter, sealed with no return address. Her name had been written across the front in neat, familiar handwriting, his handwriting. What was this? Her heart had begun to race as she picked it up, the weight of it already feeling off. The smooth, crinkling sound of the paper under her fingertips made her feel nauseous. The moment felt surreal, like a bad omen was hovering just beyond the edge of her perception. Paul hadn't noticed. He had been distracted, reaching for his phone, scrolling through emails, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She tore open the envelope with shaking hands, the familiar scent of Paul's cologne lingering on the paper as she pulled out the letter. And as she read, her world cracked open. The words were clear, crisp, and precise. I need to tell you something before it's too late. I know you'll never forgive me for what I've done, but I have to admit it now, before it ruins everything. I've been seeing someone else for months. You felt the distance, haven't you? You've known something's been off. I'm so sorry, but it's true. I'm in love with her. Her eyes stung as the words blurred before her, as if they were meant to punish her. He was in love with someone else. The betrayal, the sharp twist of his confession, everything spun out of control. The letter didn't end there. There was more. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I even want to. But I can't keep pretending. You deserve the truth. I've made a choice. Her heart dropped. He had made a choice. He had chosen her. Her chest had tightened, her hands clammy, and she could barely breathe. Every piece of her, every ounce of trust and love she had invested in him, was now crumbling into nothing. She hadn't even noticed the tears welling in her eyes until they spilled over. How could he do this to her? How could he betray everything they had built? She had dropped the letter, unable to hold it any longer, feeling the weight of betrayal like a physical force pressing down on her chest. The letter sat there on the table, mocking her as she stared at it, unable to comprehend how things had come to this point. She had trusted him. She had loved him. What followed after that was a blur of emotions. She had confronted him that night. The words, the questions, the accusations, they had all flown out in a mess of anger, fear, and disbelief. Paul had denied it at first, stumbling over his words, trying to convince her that it wasn't what it seemed. But there was no denying the truth that had been written in black and white. There was no escaping the fact that he had confessed it. He had been seeing someone else for months. And it wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything that followed. The silence that hung in their home like a heavy fog, the things they never talked about, the love that had slowly faded away. The cracks had been there all along, and now they were impossible to ignore. The next few days were filled with a frantic energy that consumed her. She had tried to fix it, tried to save it. But the truth was inescapable. She couldn't undo what had been done, and neither could he. She had loved him, yes, but she had also hated him for the lies. For the secrets. For the affair. And as their son's funeral neared, she realized that she couldn't live with the weight of those lies any longer. She had made a decision, just as Paul had. It wasn't something she was proud of, but it was something she thought she had to do. She had to take control. That decision, one she could never undo, had led to the moment when Paul walked away from her at their son's funeral. What she hadn't told him, what she hadn't shared, was that the secret she carried was far darker than just his affair. It was something far worse. Something that could destroy everything. The woman at the cemetery gates, the one whose eyes had seemed to know so much more than she should have, had recognized her. And now, more than ever, she knew that her secret wasn't safe. It was out there, and the truth would come to light, whether she was ready or not. But what was the truth? What had she done? And who had this woman been? The weight of the truth, buried so deep inside her for so long, was now pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She didn't know how much longer she could carry it, but she couldn't let go. Not yet. Not until she was ready to face the consequences of her actions. It had been 2 days since the funeral, 2 days since Paul had walked away from her at their son's gravesite. The silence that had followed had been deafening. It was the kind of silence that screams, a silence full of guilt and regret. She had barely slept, haunted by the memories of the funeral and the haunting presence of the mysterious woman who had appeared at the cemetery. Her eyes, knowing and knowing too much, had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. Who was she? Why had she stared at her like that? There was a part of her that wanted to believe it was nothing, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She knew that woman had seen something she had kept hidden from everyone, including Paul. Something she had hidden even from herself. The days had become a blur. She moved through the motions, eating, drinking, trying to sleep, but her mind was always racing, always circling back to that moment at the cemetery. To Paul walking away. To the woman. To the secret that she was so desperately trying to hold on to. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood by the kitchen window, staring out into the darkening sky. The house felt empty. Quiet. It felt like a place she no longer recognized, as though the walls were closing in around her, suffocating her with their silence. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter as she let out a deep breath. I can't keep running from it. She couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. She had to face the truth, even if it meant losing everything. Even if it meant losing Paul. She had already lost their son, and nothing could hurt more than that. But the truth, the secret, was eating her alive. The doorbell rang, cutting through her thoughts like a sharp knife. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Who could be here at this hour? It wasn't the delivery guy. It wasn't one of the neighbors. She hadn't expected anyone. She walked toward the door slowly, her pulse quickening with each step. As she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing in front of her was the woman from the cemetery. For a moment, they both just stood there, staring at each other. The woman's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something familiar, something unsettling, that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. I didn't expect you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step forward, her gaze still fixed on her. I think we need to talk, she said, her voice calm but urgent. The woman didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped into the house without hesitation, and the door clicked shut behind her. I'm sorry, but I don't know who you are, and I'm not sure what you think we need to talk about, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. The woman turned to face her, her eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her shiver. You don't know me, but I know you. I know exactly who you are. I know your story. And I know what you've done. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. What are you talking about? She finally managed to choke out. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she walked further into the house, as if she belonged there. She didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for a response. She simply walked past her and sat down on the couch, as though she had done it 100 times before. Please, she said, her voice cold but laced with something else, something almost pitying. Sit down. We need to have a conversation. It's long overdue. She stood there, unsure of what to do. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, her hands shaking with anxiety. But slowly, almost against her will, she sat down across from the woman. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, as if both of them were waiting for something to break. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice soft but commanding. "I know what happened that night. The night everything changed for you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman's eyes were locked onto hers, like a predator watching its prey. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman's gaze didn't waver. "I know what you did. I know the secret you've been hiding from everyone. From Paul. From yourself. You can't keep running from it. You can't pretend it didn't happen." Her breath caught in her throat as the woman's words echoed through her mind. The secret. The thing she had been so desperate to keep hidden, even from herself. The thing that had led to everything. Her marriage. Her son's death. Paul's betrayal. It had all come from that one moment, that one decision. You don't know anything," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She could feel the truth hanging in the air, just out of reach, threatening to break free. The woman leaned forward, her gaze never leaving hers. "I know everything. I know what you did to keep him. I know the choice you made. And I know that it's tearing you apart." Her heart raced, and her throat tightened. The air felt thick, suffocating, and she was no longer sure she could breathe. The woman stood up, slowly, as though she had all the time in the world. She took a step toward her, then stopped, her eyes narrowing. "You thought you were protecting him, didn't you? But you weren't. You were protecting yourself. You were saving your own skin." Her words struck like a dagger, and it felt as though the walls around her were closing in. "I didn't want to lose him," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. She didn't know why she said it. She didn't know why she was admitting this to a complete stranger, but it was the truth. She had been so afraid of losing Paul, of losing the only person who had ever made her feel like she mattered, that she had made a choice. A choice that had destroyed everything. "You didn't lose him because of what you did," the woman said, her voice soft now, almost sympathetic. "You lost him because of the lies. Because of the choices you made to protect yourself." Tears welled in her eyes, and she couldn't stop them. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice breaking. The woman stepped closer, her voice a whisper now. "I want you to understand. I want you to face the truth. The truth about what you did. About what happened that night." For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her mind was spinning, the truth rising to the surface. She had thought she was protecting Paul, thought she was protecting herself, but the reality was so much darker. I don't know how," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can." The woman's gaze softened, just slightly. "You have to. You have to face what you did, or it will destroy you. And if you don't, it will destroy the ones you love." And with that, the woman turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the door, her mind racing. The truth was no longer something she could ignore. It was right there, in front of her, and she couldn't run anymore. The truth would come out. And when it did, it would change everything. The house was eerily quiet. The shadows from the dimming daylight crept in, swallowing the room with a coldness that seemed to match the heaviness in her chest. She stood motionless, her hands trembling slightly as she replayed the conversation with the mysterious woman over and over in her head. The weight of those words, "I know what you did," pressed down on her like a vice, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. She had thought she could keep the secret buried, that she could go on pretending like nothing had happened. But the moment that woman had appeared at her door, everything changed. She had barely slept the previous night, her mind spinning, racing through the events that had led her here, to this point of no return. The words she had said to Paul, the secrets she had kept from him, the choices she had made that had spiraled out of control. Now, she couldn't escape the truth. And she knew that sooner or later, Paul would find out. The woman had made that much clear. It was only a matter of time before the truth would be laid bare, and nothing would ever be the same again. The woman had been right about one thing: she had made those choices out of fear, out of desperation to keep her life, to keep the family she had always dreamed of. She had thought she was protecting Paul, protecting them both, but now she saw how naive she had been. The lies, the deceit, had poisoned everything. And now, there was no going back. She walked over to the window, her eyes staring out into the empty street. The world outside was still, almost peaceful. But inside, her world was crumbling. She felt the sharp sting of regret deep within her chest, threatening to drown her. She wanted to believe that she could fix it all, that she could somehow make everything right, but deep down, she knew that wasn't possible. She had done too much damage. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Paul. He was home. The door clicked open, and she could hear his footsteps echoing through the hallway. He was here. She hadn't been prepared for this. She hadn't been prepared to face him again, to see the look in his eyes when he finally found out the truth. She had spent the last 2 days avoiding him, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to even begin. He stepped into the living room, his face drawn, tired. He hadn't shaved in a couple of days, his clothes wrinkled, his expression distant. She had seen that look on him before, when he was lost in his thoughts, when the weight of everything was too much for him to carry. But now, it was different. Now, there was a coldness to it that made her heart sink. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching her with those eyes that had once held so much love, so much understanding. Now they were empty, like he had already closed himself off from her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? What could she possibly say after everything? She had been keeping this secret for so long, running from the truth, and now it was all about to come crashing down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Paul spoke, his voice low, almost hoarse. I know. She blinked, her stomach dropping. What? I know what you did, he repeated, his voice steady, though there was a tremor in it that betrayed his composure. I know everything. Her breath caught in her throat. How could he possibly know? Had the woman told him? Had she said something? She was frantic, her mind racing to find an explanation, but the truth was, there was no explanation. He had to know. He had to understand. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice faltering as the lie left her lips. What do you think you know? He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't see what was happening between us? What was happening with you? His voice cracked for a moment, but he quickly regained control. I saw the signs, even when you tried to hide them from me. I saw how you pulled away. I saw the distance between us growing. But I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to face it. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. The truth was in the air now, heavy and undeniable. I didn't want to hurt you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to destroy everything. He shook his head, a pained expression crossing his face. You already did. The moment you made the choice to lie, to keep the truth from me, you destroyed us. You destroyed everything. The words stung more than she had ever imagined. She felt the weight of them crush her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had thought that she could hold on, that she could somehow make things right, but now she realized the damage was too great. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking as the tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I kept the secret, if I just held on, we could get through it. I thought it wouldn't matter. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment, she saw the anger in them, the same anger she had seen in his eyes when they first met. It was a fire that had once burned with passion, with love. Now it was a fire that burned with betrayal, with resentment. "You think you could keep this from me forever? You think you could keep me in the dark and that it wouldn't destroy us? You were wrong. It's already destroyed everything. I can't look at you the same way anymore. I don't even know who you are." Her heart shattered. This was the moment she had feared. This was the reckoning she had known was coming but had tried to avoid. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, was no longer the same. He was a stranger now, and all because of her. "I never meant to hurt you," she sobbed, the tears falling freely now. "I never meant for any of this to happen." He stood there, watching her, his face unreadable. "You didn't mean to hurt me, but you did. You broke everything. And now, I don't know if there's anything left to save." The silence between them was suffocating. She could feel it closing in, wrapping around her like a vice. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her world was falling apart, and she didn't know how to stop it. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know." He turned away, his steps heavy as he walked toward the door. "I don't know what to do with this anymore. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. Maybe we've gone too far." Her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as he opened the door and walked out, leaving her standing there alone, drowning in her own regret. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the empty house. The silence that followed was deafening. She stood there for a long moment, her mind spinning, her heart aching. The truth had come out. The lies had been exposed. And now there was nothing left to do but face the consequences of everything she had done. She had destroyed it all. She had destroyed the man she loved. And she didn't know how to put the pieces back together. The house felt colder now, emptier than it had ever been. The silence was suffocating, the kind that wraps itself around your chest until you can barely breathe. The air felt thick with the remnants of yesterday, thick with betrayal, regret, and the crushing weight of truths finally laid bare. The space that had once been a home, full of life, full of memories, now seemed like a tomb. The walls, once so comforting, now felt like they were closing in. She sat in the living room, the stillness overwhelming her. The tears had long since stopped falling. She had no more tears to shed, no more strength to keep pretending. She had spent the better part of the past few hours trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She had tried to find a way to fix it, a way to make everything right. But now, it seemed impossible. The pieces of her life were scattered on the floor, too broken to ever be put back together. Her mind kept returning to Paul, to the way he had looked at her before he left. The anger in his eyes, the hurt, the disgust. He had said he didn't know if he could forgive her, didn't know if there was anything left to save. She knew he meant it. He had walked out of that door without a second glance, and with every step, he had taken a part of her heart with him. He had made his choice, and there was no going back. Her hands were still trembling as she reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had tried to call him a few times, but he hadn't answered. The silence on the other end of the line had been a reminder of just how far apart they had drifted. She had known, deep down, that he needed space. But even so, the emptiness of it all gnawed at her. It was like a weight pressing on her chest that she couldn't shake. Her eyes flicked over to the family photos on the mantelpiece. She and Paul, smiling on their wedding day, arms around each other as they celebrated their love. Their son, a baby in her arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around her hand. A life that had once seemed so full of promise, so perfect, now felt like a distant dream. Everything had slipped through her fingers, and now she was left with nothing but the wreckage of the life they had built together. She felt the familiar pang of guilt stab at her chest. It had been her fault. She had made the choices that had led them here. She had made the decision to keep the secret, to protect herself rather than face the truth. She had thought she was doing the right thing, but now she could see how wrong she had been. She had lied to him, to herself, and now she was paying the price. But the truth was even more painful than the lies. The truth was that she had lost everything. She had lost Paul, and she had lost herself in the process. The sound of the front door creaking open made her heart race. She glanced toward the hallway, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be Paul. It couldn't be. He hadn't come back. Not yet. Not after what had happened. But then she heard it, the soft shuffle of footsteps on the floorboards, and a voice calling her name. She froze. Mom? She turned, her heart leaping in her chest, and there he was, her son's voice. Her heart broke all over again as she looked at him. He was standing in the doorway, his small face filled with confusion and worry. Her son was gone, but somehow, his voice had come back to her, filling the silence in the room with an echo of the life they had once shared. Her chest tightened, her throat closing up. She hadn't been able to protect him. She hadn't been able to save him, and now she was left with nothing but the memories of a life she couldn't get back. She blinked, but the vision of her son remained. Was it a hallucination? Was it a dream? She wasn't sure anymore. Her mind had been playing tricks on her since the moment she lost him, and now, in the deepest part of her grief, she wasn't sure what was real. Mom, what's going on? Her son's voice was gentle, full of concern, and it tore her apart. Why did Dad leave? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she stood up quickly, wiping them away with the back of her hand. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to see the confusion on his face, the hurt in his eyes. Her son, who should have been safe and sound, was gone, and she had failed him. I'm sorry, baby, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the couch, her hands pressed to her face as the sobs racked her body. The grief, the pain, the guilt, it all came crashing down on her in waves, leaving her drowning in the aftermath. She hadn't been able to protect him, hadn't been able to keep him safe. She hadn't been able to stop what had happened. And now, she was lost. She heard a soft click of the door opening again, and her heart skipped. This time, it wasn't her son's voice. It was Paul's. Her head snapped up, her heart hammering in her chest, but when she saw him standing in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. Paul. He stood there, his face pale, his eyes hollow, as if the life had been drained out of him. His clothes were rumpled, his hair disheveled, and there was a heaviness in the air that seemed to follow him wherever he went. I didn't know where else to go, he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Her heart fluttered in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She didn't know what to say. What could she say after everything? I've been thinking, Paul continued, taking a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. About everything. About us. And I don't know what to do. I don't know what to feel. But I can't just walk away. I can't just leave things like this. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment she had feared. She had thought Paul would walk away for good, that he would leave her behind like a broken, shattered piece of the past. But here he was, standing in front of her, his voice cracking, his eyes filled with pain and confusion. I don't know if I can forgive you, Paul whispered, his voice full of anguish. I don't know if I can ever forget what happened. But I can't keep running away from this. From us. She stood up, her legs weak beneath her, and walked toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt that had settled deep within him. He didn't know what to do with it, just as she didn't know what to do with her own. I'm so sorry, she said again, her voice broken. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. Paul sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know you didn't. But we can't keep living like this. We can't keep pretending like everything is okay when it's not." She stepped closer to him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his arm. "Paul, I know I've hurt you. I know I've lied to you, but please, let's try. Let's try to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Please." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, and for a brief second, she thought he might turn away again. But then, something shifted. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached out, taking her hand in his. "I don't know if we can fix it," he said quietly. "But maybe, just maybe, we can start over." The room was silent as they stood there, hands intertwined, both of them uncertain, both of them broken, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a guarantee. But it was something. It was a chance. And for the first time in so long, it felt like the darkness that had consumed her might finally begin to lift. The days that followed felt like a blur of conflicting emotions. Each morning, she would wake up with the weight of her mistakes heavy on her chest, her mind racing through the events of the past weeks. The secret, the lies, Paul's anger, the woman at the cemetery, all of it felt like a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. She had hoped that everything would magically fall into place, that the truth would somehow make things better, but it hadn't. The road to healing wasn't as simple as saying sorry. It wasn't about making promises and hoping things would go back to normal. No, the road ahead was going to be long, and it was going to be painful. The first morning after Paul had come back felt different. He hadn't said much, but they had agreed to give it time, to see if there was any way to salvage what had been broken. He didn't move back in right away. They were both trying to figure out what to do next, how to navigate the mess they were in. They were like two people standing on a tightrope, unsure of each other's next move, afraid of falling. She had tried to keep herself busy, working on small things around the house, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. But normal felt like a distant memory. The house was still cold, and the silence between them was deafening. It wasn't just the silence of two people who weren't speaking, it was the silence of two people who didn't know how to speak anymore. Everything had changed. Everything felt different. Nothing was the same. The guilt had a way of creeping in at the worst times. It would hit her like a wave, overwhelming her and threatening to drown her. She hadn't been able to fix things with Paul, not yet. And with every passing day, the fear grew that she might never be able to fix it. That the distance between them was too vast, too deep. That he might never be able to look at her the way he used to. That the love they once shared had disappeared, leaving nothing but a hollow shell behind. But even in the darkest moments, she knew one thing: she couldn't give up. She couldn't just let go. She couldn't keep living in the past. She had to fight. She had to try. One morning, as the sun began to rise and cast a golden light over the house, she stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the world beyond. The air was crisp, the birds were singing, and the world seemed to be going on as usual, unaffected by the storm that had torn through her life. She had always thought that life would just keep moving forward, that time would heal everything. But she had come to realize that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't something that just appeared. It was something that had to be fought for, something that had to be earned. She heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her, and before she could turn, she knew it was Paul. He had been walking through the house in the mornings, keeping to himself, still processing everything. But today, there was something different in his presence. She felt it in the way he moved, in the quiet energy that seemed to fill the space between them. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice tentative, unsure of how to bridge the silence that still hung between them. Paul didn't immediately respond. He stood next to her, his gaze fixed on the same view she was looking at. The moment stretched, the weight of the past hanging heavily in the air, but he finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking," he began, his words deliberate, measured. "About everything. About what happened. And about us." Her heart raced as she turned to face him, her mind bracing for whatever he was about to say. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't know if this was the moment where he would finally tell her he couldn't do this anymore, that it was over. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something else. Something that wasn't anger or resentment. It wasn't even the cold indifference she had feared. It was something much more fragile. Hope. "I don't know if I can forgive you for everything," Paul continued, his gaze meeting hers. "I don't know if we can go back to how things were. But I do know one thing, I'm willing to try." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to disappear. He was willing to try. Those words were like a lifeline, a glimmer of light in the darkness that had surrounded them for so long. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve for you to even look at me, but I—" Paul interrupted her, his hand gently reaching out to take hers. "Stop," he said quietly. "You can't keep punishing yourself. You've paid the price. I've seen the pain in your eyes. I know what you've been through. I can't just walk away from that. I can't walk away from you." She squeezed his hand, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. It was a start. It wasn't a guarantee, it wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope deep inside her. "I don't know how we're going to get through this," Paul said, his voice uncertain. "But I want to try. I want to try with you. I want to try to rebuild what we lost. We've both made mistakes. But maybe, just maybe, we can find our way back to each other." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, overwhelmed by the emotions that flooded through her. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how things would turn out. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like there was a path ahead. A path that might lead them back to each other, or at least, to a place where they could heal. "I'm willing to try too," she whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes." The days that followed were filled with quiet conversations, long walks, and moments of vulnerability that neither of them had ever allowed themselves before. They didn't rush things. They didn't pretend that everything was okay. But they began to rebuild. Slowly. One step at a time. There were still hard days. There were days when the memories of their son's loss overwhelmed them both. There were days when the weight of the past seemed too heavy to carry. But they didn't give up. They fought for each other. They fought for the love they once had, the love they still shared, even if it was buried under layers of hurt and betrayal. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Paul took her hand in his and squeezed it gently. "Maybe this is just the beginning," he said softly. "Maybe we'll never be the same. Maybe we'll never go back to who we were. But I think we can be something new. I think we can find our way through this. Together." She smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded. Together. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she believed it. She believed that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know where the road ahead would lead. But they had each other. And that was enough. The road to healing would be long. It would be difficult. But it was a road they would walk together. And that, in itself, was a kind of victory. The story reaches a point of tentative reconciliation. The emotional weight that has been building throughout the narrative begins to shift as the characters begin to open up and make the choice to try again. Though the future remains uncertain, there is a sense of hope as the protagonist and Paul take the first steps toward rebuilding their relationship, understanding that healing is a long, ongoing process. The conclusion reflects the theme of resilience, forgiveness, and the power of love even after betrayal. It leaves the story open-ended, allowing for further exploration of the emotional journey of recovery.